right, so I just wanted to share a little thing I found. So, the discovery itself isn't that great, but it leads to some interesting things. Um, and so the discovery is that a wire, the power going through a wire can't really pass through a button. So if I had this sort of a setup, let's say, this power would not go to this dot connection point over here. Um, can show that real quick. You can see it only goes to the button, it doesn't go through it. So that leads me to this sort of idea where input comes in through the top, output is through the bottom. Um, and because the signal cannot pass through the button, it's basically a one-way wire. Um, and it does take a little bit of time, obviously, for the fish to hit the button, but it does automatically reset because the button is connected to the door. So it is a one-way wire, but it comes at the cost of taking a little bit of time for the fish to actually press the button. There are ways of making it faster, but for the sake of just showing the idea, um, this is good enough. In order to split the signal into two different signals, you can obviously just like put two pulse modules side by side and it splits it into two. You would not be able to do this without the one-way wire pulse, because if you just like say connected this directly here and then this directly here, you could get uh, power flowing backwards basically. So if this wire was powered, it would also end up powering this other one backwards. Um, so you can see this one is called split plus clock. And basically it's just the split module on the left and then a pulse module on the right. And this will be a little bit more relevant when I get into the next few, but just keep in mind the idea that passing a quote unquote clock pulse through this split module is important. So now we get to read plus clock. So if you want to read out a solid signal, so like, let's say we had like a power source that went on, it didn't go off of a pulse like these one-way wires do. They just, constantly produce power. This basically reads that constant pulse or that constant signal and turns it into a pulse. And then of course it does that on a clock tick. So you can see this gate here now depends on the pulse coming out of from the clock basically. So the clock gets delayed, goes into this AND gate, and then this constant signal can be output. So because of the pulse on the left, this constant signal gets turned into a pulse. And then the clock signal itself gets passed along again. And so now that we can read constant signals, we can also invert a signal. So normally the way that you would do that is you would basically have a gate that is connected to constant power, and it only has one. So let's say, input output for the sake of example. This would basically invert the input, right? If there's no input, then this power would just pass through. If there is an input, then this gate would have two inputs and therefore would not output. But again, we can't use a constant signal because we're dealing with pulses everywhere. So this module here is just to invert the input using a pulse. So the left one is the actual signal that we're inverting. You can see it goes through the same gate, but it does it on a clock pulse. So you can see the clock uh, is tied to this gate, which turns it into a pulse, and then it goes into the inverter, and then that clock pulse is carried through. Now, as long as everything else is tied to the clock, we actually don't need any special module or anything for just like an AND gate. For example, let's say we have, two inputs and output. Oops. Something like this. This would work perfectly fine because everything else is on a pulse. As long as we time everything correctly, then both pulse signals will come into the gate at the same time, and then it'll just pass along the pulse. Same thing for a quote unquote OR gate. It's a little bit simpler here, but either inputs could be powered, and then it would power the last one, and it doesn't matter again because it's as long as both inputs come in on the exact same pulse, then it'll output on the same pulse. So what we can do with this is we can chain these together in a very special way to make much more complicated circuits. And so over here, this is a very large circuit unnecessarily, basically because I just sort of mindlessly copy and pasted the modules over here and chained them together, but this could obviously be cleaned up a lot. And I'll show you what this is doing. So this is actually a 1-bit storage, or basically like a latch of sorts. So the button on the right is the clock pulse, and the button on the left, it's a switch button, so that just determines whether or not we want to store a bit. And so if I hit the clock, you can see nothing happens. That smiley face on the right represents whether or not we're actually storing a value. So because it's not there, we're not storing a value. And I can press this as many times as I want, and it's not going to store anything. But if I power this other one and then pulse the clock, you can see the smiley face turns on. And if I keep trying to pulse the clock, because this signal is constantly on, then we're maintaining our storage. If I turn it off and then pulse the clock again, you can see it turns off. So it is a 1-bit storage. And again, this whole thing is quite bulky. You have to like copy and paste just these pulse modules by themselves to make sure that the timing of everything lines up. But obviously carrying the clock pulse through each one of these modules helps a lot with timing everything. So you can sort of, lay everything out in a grid sort of structure, and as long as the wires are all in the correct place, you're good. And again, like I said, these AND gates and the OR gate don't really need special timing. They just work. But yeah, so it's a little bit slow because you have to wait for each row of fish to hit their buttons, which takes time. It could be sped up by, pushing the button closer, and then instead of having the fish bounce off of a solid wall, you can have it bounce off of a door that's off grid, so it can be, closer to the fish itself. But basically you need the fish to be able to be in 2 different states, and you needed to be able to toggle between those 2 different states. You could do that a lot smaller if you mess around with off-grid stuff, but for the sake of example, I didn't do that. Yeah, like I said, the other thing is that this signal here, this is one of the clock signals that got passed through. This obviously doesn't need to be here, so we can do a little bit of optimization / cleanup by removing everything that's tied to that. So one thing about this circuit is that I have not set it up to read from the output yet. Um, I mean, you could in theory wire something to this button here, like I have with the smiley face, but when we're dealing with clock pulses, again, you would have to use one of these read plus clock modules in order to actually read out the constant output. Um, and so there is actually one of these modules in the circuit, but that's just for storing the data, not for reading it out. So I would probably need to add some more circuitry to actually, be able to read the data. But yeah, so I thought that was pretty cool. I think it's likely possible to actually make a full computer using this stuff. I don't know the limits of the Will You Snail level editor, but again, if you make certain optimizations, I think you could potentially make a complete, albeit very small, computer. So yeah.